A new Justice Department filing says a Department of Government Efficiency employee mishandled Social Security data. That filing claims the Social Security Administration still doesn't know what information was shared. This is the first time the Trump administration has acknowledged that DOGE employees mishandled the data.
I want you to stop for a second and take inventory. Your wallet, your phone, your keys. You know exactly where those things are right now. You know who has access to them. You know what's in them, and if someone tried to take any of them from you, you'd respond immediately. Because those things are yours, and you know it. Now I want you to think about something else you carry with you. Something you can't see, you can't touch, can't put in a drawer at night. Something that has followed you since the day you were born and will follow your name long after you're gone. Your social security number, your date of birth, the city you were born in, your citizenship status, your race and ethnicity, your parents' full names, your phone number and your address. That is your documented identity, not the performed one, the permanent one, the one that exists in federal systems, the one banks verify against, the one the IRS uses when they need to find you, and the one that employers use to do background checks on you, the one that connects every financial, medical, and governmental record tied to your existence in this country. And right now, today, as you're listening to this, there is an open federal investigation into whether all of that information for you and 500 million other Americans, living and dead, is sitting on a thumb drive on someone's desk somewhere in a private company. Allegedly carried out the door by a government contractor who, according to a whistleblower complaint under active investigation, said he expected a presidential pardon if anyone decided that what he was doing was against the law. You probably didn't hear about this in the news last night. You may have caught a headline somewhere and kept scrolling because it sounded technical. Because it's harder to process a story about databases and whistleblower complaints than it is a story about a political fight with clear teams and clear sides. That's the trap, and today we're going to look directly at it for as long as it takes. You're listening to Trap Think. I'm Darren, and today we're not doing left versus right. We're not doing pro-Doge or anti-Doge. We're doing something harder than that. We're doing citizen, as in a person who has a social security number, who pays taxes, who is trusted without thinking about it that the infrastructure of identity in this country is being held carefully by people with clear authority and clear accountability. That trust is what's at stake right now, and by the end of this episode, I want you to understand, not just know, but understand exactly why. Proverbs 4:7, wisdom is the principal thing, therefore, get wisdom, and in all you're getting, get understanding. Not just information, understanding. Because information without understanding is exactly what the systems around you are counting on. They give you enough data to feel informed, but not enough context to actually see what's happening. They keep you reacting, keep you outraged on rotation, keep you picking sides, and as long as you're doing that, as long as your energy is going into the argument, you'll never stop long enough to ask the question that actually matters. Today's episode is about a story that has been in front of us for almost a year. The information has been available, whistleblowers have filed complaints, courts have held hearings, senators have issued statements, inspectors general have opened investigations, and most people have no idea what's happening. That's not a failure of information, it's a failure of understanding, and that's what we're here to fix. Let's build the foundation, because this story keeps getting framed as a DOGE story, as a political story about Elon Musk, government efficiency, and the ongoing war between the Trump administration and the administrative state. And while that framing isn't completely wrong, it's incomplete in ways that make the real story kind of impossible to see. So let's start with what most people understand about DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. The public understanding goes something like this. It's an initiative backed by Elon Musk and the White House aimed at reducing the cost and size of the federal government, cutting headcounts, eliminating redundant programs, auditing contracts, finding the bloat and removing it. The name, Department of Government Efficiency, is technically a branding exercise. DOGE is not a cabinet-level department with statutory authority the way the Department of Defense or the Department of the Treasury is. It operates through informal authority, White House backing, and the placement of aligned personnel inside existing agencies. It moves fast, it doesn't announce itself in advance, and it has sent engineers and technical staff into federal agencies across the executive branch. Depending on where you sit politically, DOGE is either a long overdue audit of a government that has grown wildly beyond its mandate, or it's a reckless demolition operation being run by tech billionaires who have no accountability to the public that they're affecting. The debate is real, and I'm not going to resolve it right now because that's not the point of this episode. The point is, what was DOGE actually doing inside the Social Security Administration? And does the answer match the stated mission? Well, here's what we know. At the Social Security Administration, the SSA, at least a dozen DOGE employees were installed. Most of them were described as young software engineers and technical staff, and according to reporting that has not been disputed, their actual roles and activities were not communicated to the career employees working around them. People who had spent careers at that agency, people with security clearances, institutional knowledge, and decades of professional investment in protecting the data they manage, did not know what these engineers were doing, why they had been placed there, or what they were accessing. Now let me sit on that for a second, because it's easy to read past it. If your stated mission is efficiency, if you're there to find waste or streamline operations, identify redundant systems, secrecy from the people you're working alongside is kind of counterproductive. Efficiency work requires cooperation. It requires people to show you where things are, explain why processes exist, tell you what's essential and what isn't. You don't sneak around an agency you're supposed to be auditing. The secrecy itself suggests a different kind of mission. And then there's the access question. The Supreme Court, in a ruling last summer, granted DOGE members what court documents described as unfettered access to Social Security data, not supervised access, not access with defined scope and purpose, not access subject to review and limitation, unfettered access. Now, I want you to ask a question, and I want you to actually think about the answer before we move on, because the answer matters. If DOGE's mission is identifying wasteful government spending, auditing contracts, finding redundancies, streamlining operations, why does that mission require access to your Social Security number, your date of birth, your parents' names, your birthplace, your race and ethnicity? Auditing a government program for efficiency means looking at how the program operates. Headcount, contracts, cost per outcome, redundant infrastructure, process bottlenecks. None of that requires access to the personal biographic data of the American citizens that program serves. There is no version of, we need to reduce administrative costs at the SSA that logically requires unrestricted access to the master identity file of every living American. That's not a partisan statement. That's not an ideological position. It's just logic. And the fact that nobody was asking that question loudly and publicly when the access was granted is itself part of the story. So what's the access actually for? We're going to spend this entire episode answering that question, or at least mapping what we know about the answer. But first, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with, because I don't think most people have any real sense of the scale of what the Social Security Administration actually holds. There are two databases at the center of this story. The news coverage has been treating them as technical background details, something to briefly name before moving on to the political drama. They're not background. They're the whole story. And I want to spend real time on them because I think that once you understand what these databases actually are, the rest of this episode is going to hit a lot different. The first database is called Numident. It stands for Numerical Identification System. It is the Social Security Administration's master identity file. And when I say master identity file, I want you to hear that in the most comprehensive, most literal sense possible. Numident holds the following information: your name, your Social Security number, your date and place of birth, your citizenship status, your race and ethnicity, your parents' full names, your phone number, and your address. Not for some Americans, not for Americans who have interacted with the SSA in some certain way, for virtually every American taxpayer who has ever been issued a Social Security number. That's approximately 330 million living people, every single one of them, including you, the person who's listening to this right now, so much as you're a citizen. The second database is called the Death Master File. It contains records for every American who has been reported as deceased, with documentation going back generations. And when you combine the two databases, Numident for the living, Death Master File for the dead, you have records on more than 500 million people. Let me give you a sense of what that number means. The entire population of the United States right now is approximately 335 million people. 500 million records means that this database contains the documented identity of every living American, plus the records of more than 160 million Americans who have died. It is, in the most literal sense, a record of who this country is and who it has been. I need you to do something. I need you to set aside the mental model that your brain defaults to when it hears the words data breach, because that mental model is going to lead you in the wrong direction. When most people hear about data breach, they think credit card number, password reset email, maybe a free year of credit monitoring. Annoying, a little stressful, ultimately resolved in a 2-hour password reset session. You cancel the card, you change those passwords, and then you move on. That mental model does not apply here, not remotely. A social security number is not a password. It's not a credit card number. It is a permanent government-issued identifier that follows you from the day it was assigned, usually shortly after your birth, to the day that your death is recorded, and then beyond. It cannot be changed the way you change a password. It cannot be canceled and reissued the way you cancel a credit card. The process for actually reissuing a social security number is so administratively complex, so burdensome, and so rare that the SSA does it only in the most extreme documented cases of ongoing, proven, severe identity theft. Cases where the person can demonstrate that keeping their existing number makes their life functionally impossible. And here's what you need to understand about why that matters. An internal SSA risk assessment, a formal document produced by career cybersecurity officials at the agency when DOGE first started accessing this data, raised the possibility of having to literally reissue social security numbers to millions of Americans if that data was seriously compromised. That was the agency's own risk calculus, not a worst-case scenario invented by critics. The people who protect this data, whose entire professional lives are organized around protecting this data, looked at what was happening and said, if this goes sideways, we may need to restructure how identity works in the United States. Think about what that would mean in practice. Every loan you have ever applied for, every tax return you've ever filed, every background check, every bank account, every employment record, every medical record, every government benefit tied to your identity, all of it traces back to that 9-digit number. And if that number is compromised at scale, if someone has it alongside your date of birth, your parents' names, your birthplace, yada, 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 they don't just have your credit card. They have enough to be you, to file taxes as you, to open accounts as you, to access the government systems as you, to construct fraudulent identities that are, to many verification systems, indistinguishable from the real one. And there is no undo button for that. The former SSA Chief Data Officer Charles Borges, the man who spent his career managing this data and who we're going to talk about extensively in this next section, said this week there could be 1 or a million copies of it, and we will literally never know. 1 or a million copies. We're never going to know. That is the irreversibility at the center of this story. That's why it's different from every other data breach story you've ever heard. That's why the stakes are not abstract and not political. They are personal, permanent, and they belong to every single person listening to this right now.
So Social Security data is your most sensitive personal information. It's the information that's on your birth certificate. So, when you apply for a mortgage and you have to answer security questions, and it's what's your mother's maiden name and what's your place of birth and what's your father's middle name. All of that information is held resident at Social Security. Mm-hmm. So to put that personally identifiable information that can be used to propagate identity theft, mortgage fraud, steal small business loans, impersonate dead people into an environment where it could be downloaded or accessed inappropriately or stolen or shared, it's a risk to literally every single living and dead American's ability to have a daily life.
You see, we're not talking about a simple inconvenience. We're not talking about a political embarrassment for one administration or another. We are talking about the foundation of how identity works in the United States. And there is credible, documented, actively investigated evidence that it may have walked out the door of a federal agency on a thumb drive. Now let's talk about how we got here, because this didn't start last week. This story has been building for almost a year, and the way it's been handled at every stage tells you exactly as much as the breach itself. One of the most important things to understand about the DOGE SSA story is that it didn't begin with a thumb drive. That's the headline that finally broke through, barely, this week. But the thumb drive is the third act of a story that has been unfolding since the summer of 2025. A story with a documented paper trail, a story in which the warnings were filed, the alarms were raised, the denials were issued, and the news cycle just moved on repeatedly before anyone connected the dots at scale. I want to walk you through the timeline carefully because the timeline is itself the argument. Summer of 2025. Charles Borges is the Social Security Administration's Chief Data Officer. He is a career civil servant. His entire professional responsibility is the protection of the data we just spent the last segment talking about. And in August of 2025, he filed a protected whistleblower disclosure. His complaint alleges that DOGE-affiliated officials had requested and received permission to copy the Numident database into a self-administered cloud environment, not the SSA's own secure cloud infrastructure, a separate cloud environment operated outside the agency's normal security protocols and outside the independent oversight that governs how federal data is stored and accessed. Career cybersecurity officials within the SSA had formally rated this transfer request as very high risk. There is a document, a risk assessment form that was dated June 16, 2025, that explicitly recommended the production data should not be used. The recommendation was overridden. The request was signed off by a DOGE-aligned official who was serving briefly as the agency's acting chief information officer. Borges raised the alarm. He filed through proper channels. He documented everything. The SSA's public response was denial. The data, they said, was stored in a secure environment. Nothing to see here. Borges' complaint was submitted to the Office of Special Counsel for review. Months passed. He was eventually told that the Office of Special Counsel would stop reviewing his allegations while the Government Accountability Office conducted a broader government-wide audit of DOGE's data access. In other words, his complaint was transferred to a slower process and effectively shelved.
Borges said DOGE employees uploaded the database to a server that only DOGE could access that did not have the type of independent security monitoring typically required, despite a Social Security Administration assessment that determined the project was high risk and could have a catastrophic impact if the cloud server were breached.
January 2026. The story resurfaces, not through a new whistleblower, but through federal court. The Trump administration's own Justice Department, in documents filed as part of an ongoing litigation over DOGE's access to SSA systems, acknowledged the following. DOGE members had accessed and shared sensitive Social Security data without the awareness of agency officials. DOGE employees had circumvented the SSA's IT rules. They had used unapproved third-party services to share private records with DOGE staffers outside the agency. They had access to some data even after a federal judge had temporarily ordered that access blocked. And then this. Court filings revealed that SSA had found DOGE employees had communicated with a political advocacy group about matching Social Security data with state voter rolls. Let me be precise about what that means. Government contractors with unfettered access to your Social Security records that include your address, your citizenship status, your biographic details, were in communication with a political advocacy group about using that data to cross-reference voter information. That is not an efficiency solution. That is not an audit function. That is a political function using the most sensitive identity database in the federal government. 2 DOGE employees were referred to a federal watchdog for potentially violating the Hatch Act, the law that prohibits government employees from using their official positions for partisan political activity. That referral was noted in the same January court filings.
A whistleblower complaint has raised serious data security concerns inside the U.S. Social Security Administration, according to the Washington Post. A former employee of Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, that is DOGE, is accused of stealing Americans' personal data from the U.S. Social Security Administration. The whistleblower complaint, it claims the former software engineer stored this sensitive data on a thumb drive after leaving the agency. The individual, who previously worked at the Social Security Administration last year, later joined a government contractor in October. At his new job, he reportedly told colleagues that he possessed 2 highly restricted government databases. The databases, known as Numident and the Master Death File, contained records of more than 500 million living and deceased Americans. The data can include Social Security numbers, dates and places of birth, citizenship details, race and ethnicity.
The Justice Department admitted that 2 members of the Department of Government Efficiency may have mishandled Social Security data by using it to match state voter rolls in violation of the Hatch Act. The federal law prohibits government employees from using their positions for political purposes. The alleged misconduct was revealed in a court document filed by DOJ Civil Division official Elizabeth Shapiro. The Social Security Administration referred the two unidentified DOGE employees to the Office of Special Counsel for potential violations of the Hatch Act last month. SSA officials were of the understanding that the two DOGE employees needed to access the agency's records to root out waste, fraud, and abuse, Shapiro explained. However, the SSA determined that the DOGE team had an ulterior motive. A political advocacy group allegedly contacted DOGE to analyze state voter rolls that the group had acquired, according to the court document. The purported purpose of the request was to uncover voter fraud and overturn election results in some states. While communicating with the political advocacy group, one of the DOGE employees signed a, quote, voter data agreement in March 2025. The DOJ official stressed it remains unclear whether the two DOGE team members actually shared data with the political advocacy group, which was also not identified in the filing. Furthermore, the Social Security data in question was allegedly shared via a third-party server named Cloudflare, unbeknownst to the SSA.
In a court filing earlier this month, the Trump administration amended what it had previously disclosed, writing that one DOGE employee at SSA signed an agreement with an unnamed political advocacy group to analyze voter rolls to, quote, find evidence of voter fraud and to overturn election results in certain states. In another instance, a DOGE member shared personally identifiable information of 1,000 people in an encrypted email attachment, though the government says they aren't sure what specifically was shared or whether it was accessed. And SSA also said DOGE shared data on third-party cloud servers that are, quote, outside SSA's security protocols, so the agency doesn't know what information was shared or if it still exists on the server.
Now, what happened after those January revelations? Coverage? For a day or two, then the news just moved on. March 2026, just this past week. The Washington Post reports that a whistleblower, a different whistleblower from Borges, filing a separate complaint, has gone to the SSA's Inspector General with a new set of allegations. This complaint describes a former DOGE software engineer. He worked at the Social Security Administration last year. In October 2025, he left the SSA and went to work for a private government contractor. And at his new job, according to the complaint, he told multiple coworkers, not one, multiple, that he possessed two tightly restricted databases of American citizens' information, specifically Numident and the Death Master File, more than 500 million records. He allegedly told a colleague that he had at least one of those databases stored on a personal thumb drive. He allegedly asked that colleague to help him transfer the data from the thumb drive to his personal computer so he could sanitize it, strip out personally identifying fields, and then upload it to his new company's systems. The colleague refused on legal grounds. And when the colleague expressed those concerns, according to the complaint, the engineer's response was that he wasn't worried. He expected to receive a presidential pardon if what he had done turned out to be illegal.
The former employee also claimed he had God-level access to Social Security systems during his time at the agency. The Social Security Administration has denied these allegations. A spokesperson said that no data was stolen and accused the Washington Post of publishing false reports to scare the seniors.
The whistleblower complaint was filed with the SSA's Inspector General on January 9th, amended on January 26th, and the IG formally notified congressional committees of the investigation on March 6th. The Washington Post broke the story on March 10th. And here's what's not in dispute. The Inspector General of the Social Security Administration has opened a formal investigation. The Government Accountability Office is conducting its own audit. Multiple congressional committees have launched probes. The former chief data officer, whose allegations were denied in 2025, has since been told by the Justice Department that many of his original allegations were, in fact, accurate. And Charles Borges, who has watched this unfold for 9 months, who has filed a complaint in August, who was told he was wrong, who waited while the denials accumulated, said this when the latest allegations broke. This is exactly the scenario that kept me up at night. An irrecoverable loss of the entirety of our personal data. Once that data has left the building, you cannot close Pandora's box again. The denials have a track record, and the track record is not good. I want to spend some serious time on the official response, because the way the story has been handled by the institutions involved is, in some ways, as important as the data breach itself. maybe more important, because the response pattern is not accidental. It's a playbook, and once you see it, you'll recognize it in every story like this one that comes after. When the Washington Post published the thumb drive story this week, the Social Security Administration issued an official response. The spokesperson said, and I'm going to give you the exact language because the exact language is the point. They said the Washington Post was, quote, desperate for clicks and eager to publish fake news to scare seniors. Let's take that sentence apart because it's doing at least 4 things simultaneously, and none of those things are addressing the substance of the allegation. The first move is the source attack, desperate for clicks. That phrase is a motive attack. It says nothing about whether the reporting is accurate. It says only that the publication has bad intentions. The strategy is, if you can get the audience to distrust the messenger, the message doesn't have to be evaluated on its merits. The second move is the fake news invocation. That phrase has been so thoroughly weaponized over the last several years that for a significant portion of the American public, it now functions as a cognitive off switch. It doesn't require engagement with content. It triggers dismissal by association. You don't have to refute what the Post reported. You just have to attach it to the fake news label and let the audience's pre-existing response pattern do the work. The third move is victim reassignment. Scare seniors. Watch what that does. Suddenly, the story is no longer about a political breach of 500 million Americans' identity records. It's been reframed as a predatory media organization trying to frighten elderly people. The SSA's actual constituency, the people whose data is at risk, have now been repositioned as the victims of the journalism rather than potential victims of the breach. It's a genuinely elegant rhetorical move, and it's completely dishonest. The fourth move is the flat denial. Not an explanation, not a transparent accounting of what actually happened, not an invitation for independent verification, just, it's false. We've investigated, move along.
Well, speaking to that timeline, Deborah, the court filing was on January 16. There were a number of corrections to the previous testimony from agency officials. What's your understanding of why it took so long for the government to correct those previous testimonies?
Because the government's not telling us the truth. I still don't think we know the full story. The allegations that Mr. Borges raised are quite serious, and he raised them with the federal agency that is responsible, Office of Special Counsel, for investigating his disclosures. And rather than investigating it, they've kicked it to a different agency. In terms of his retaliation claims, they haven't investigated it at all. So we have a situation, in a very real sense, where the fox is guarding the hen house.
Now, here's the tell. The tell is always in what the institution does after the denial. The SSA issued that denial, and then, 2 days later, the Inspector General of the Social Security Administration opened a formal investigation. You do not open an Inspector General investigation into something that you have confirmed is fake. The IG is an independent oversight body. It doesn't launch probes in response to journalism that it is internally confirmed is false. When the IG opens an investigation, it's because there is credible evidence that warrants the investigation. That is the whole point of the office. So, the agency said it was fake news. The independent watchdog inside that same agency opened an investigation. You have to choose which of those two actions to believe, and I would argue that the institution whose entire professional purpose is independent oversight of the agency is the one giving you the more reliable signal.
Do you believe it could be limited to just 1,000?
No.
There's no way?
No.
And why not?
So, again, my disclosure outlined a pattern of bad behavior. This court filing validates the first 2 pieces of that puzzle. The third piece has not yet been validated or refuted yet with any documentation. But if the first 2 allegations are correct, I'm very concerned about the third. As far as the 300 million, that was just initial news reporting. That database houses personal information, as I understand it, on all living and dead Americans. So this is a real risk to everybody.
And then there's the pardon line. I've been sitting with this detail since I first encountered it in the reporting this week, and I keep coming back to it because I think it's the single most revealing piece of information in this entire story. According to the whistleblower complaint, a complaint that is now under formal federal investigation, when a colleague raised legal concerns about the data transfer, the engineer said he expected to receive a presidential pardon if what he had done was found to be illegal. Think about the architecture of that response. He's not saying he did nothing wrong. He's not saying that the data is fine and that the concerns are unfounded. He is saying, I know this might be illegal, and I believe I am protected from the consequences because of who I am connected to. That is not a response from a person who is innocent. That is the response of a person who has made a calculation, that their access to power insulates them from accountability, and has shared that calculation openly with coworkers. That is the kind of confidence that comes from operating inside a system where the rules genuinely do not apply equally. And whether that confidence turns out to be warranted or not, the fact that it was expressed in those terms is a window into something significant about how power is actually operating in these institutions right now. TrapThink doesn't tell you who to hate. I'm not telling you to hate this engineer. I'm telling you to look at what that statement describes and ask yourself, what kind of system produces that? Here's where I want to push past the partisan frame, because the partisan frame is itself a trap, and I want to be very direct about that. If you consume this story from the left, the frame goes like this. DOGE is corrupt. Musk is dangerous. Trump is weaponizing the government data for political purposes. And this is evidence of authoritarian ambition. That frame may contain accurate elements, may not, but it is designed to make this a team sport. And when it becomes a team sport, half the country defends it automatically and the story stops being about the data. If you consume this story from the right, the frame goes like this. The media is exaggerating. The deep state is trying to undermine legitimate government reform. The whistleblowers are politically motivated actors, and this is another manufactured scandal. That frame also may contain some valid questions, but it is designed to make this about loyalty rather than accountability. And when it becomes about loyalty, the questions that actually matter never get asked. Both frames are the trap. Neither one helps you understand what happened. Neither one protects you. So let's ask a different question. Not who's the villain, but what is the architecture? What does the actual document record, stripped of partisan framing on either side, actually show? 1. DOGE installed technical staff inside a major federal agency whose entire purpose is managing the most sensitive identity database in the country. Their activities were not disclosed to career staff. This is not standard audit procedure. 2. Those staff obtained access to that database and went beyond what any outside contractor had ever been granted. Access described in court documents as unfettered. 3. Credible whistleblower allegations now under formal investigation describe that data being removed to an unsanctioned cloud environment, shared through unapproved outside services, and potentially carried out of the agency on a personal thumb drive. 4. At least 2 DOGE employees were referred for Hatch Act violations after communicating with a political advocacy group about using Social Security data to cross-reference voter rolls. Their access to the data was not an efficiency function, it was a political function. 5. At every stage, the cloud transfer, the court filings, the thumb drive story, the official response has been denial, followed by attack on the source. At every stage, independent investigators have found the underlying allegations credible enough to pursue. Now, I want you to do something with those 5 points. I want you to set aside everything you know about the political figures involved. Set aside DOGE, set aside Musk, set aside Trump, set aside every political association this story carries. Just look at the architecture. If you were designing a system to access and extract the most comprehensive identity data set in American history, one that could be used for commercial data modeling, for political targeting, for identity verification services, for any number of private sector applications that would be enormously valuable, what would that system look like? It would need access. It would need that access to be granted by authority, ideally court-sanctioned authority. It would need secrecy from the people who would otherwise notice what was happening. It would need a plausible official justification that doesn't require explaining what the access is actually for. And it would need an exit, a way to get that data out of the controlled federal environment and into a context where it could be used. I'm not telling you that this is what this is. I seriously don't know the full intent behind what happened, and anyone who tells you that they do is getting ahead of the evidence. What I am telling you is that the architecture of what happened, the access, the secrecy, the cloud transfers, the voter roll communication, the thumb drive, the pardon expectation, is consistent with that design. And the people asking hard questions about it keep getting told to stop asking. That is not an exoneration. That is a pattern. And here is the structural reality that needs to be said plainly, because it is not being said often enough or loudly enough. If this data has been compromised in the way the whistleblowers allege, there is no fix. There's no patch. There is no system update that makes this right. There is no notification letter that you send 330 million people that undoes the compromise. There is no credit monitoring service that covers your race, your parents' names, your citizenship status, your entire biographic fingerprint. Charles Borges, the man whose entire professional life was dedicated to protecting this data, who saw it happen, who told the truth at professional cost, who was told he was wrong, and who was eventually proven right, said that the worst-case outcome would require significant federal action, counterintelligence planning and response, and the consideration of a complete redesign of how the identity works in the United States. A complete redesign of how identity works in the U.S. And that story got 2 days of coverage, and you didn't hear about it. I want to talk to you about why you probably didn't see this story dominating your feed last week, because the answer to that question is, in some ways, more important than the story itself. Understanding why important things disappear is as valuable as understanding the important things, because once you see the disappearing mechanism, you stop being subject to it. The DOGE SSA story is hard to make immediately emotionally engaging. There's no video. There's no single dramatic moment you can compress into a clip. You're not going to find a ton of this on YouTube. There is no face you can put on the threat. The harm is not yet visible. Nobody has knocked on your door. Your accounts haven't been drained. Your identity hasn't been used against you in a way you would recognize. From the outside, looking at your life right now, nothing looks different. And that's exactly how the most serious institutional failures work. Think about the failures that have hit ordinary Americans hardest over the last several decades. The savings and loan crisis of the 1980s wiped out more than $100 billion before most Americans knew what was happening. Enron's employees were losing their retirement savings while the executives were still appearing on financial television recommending the stock. The subprime mortgage architecture that collapsed in 2008 was in place for years, building quietly, growing silently until the day that it failed all at once. None of those catastrophes announced themselves with video and a clear villain. They were built in the structure of systems that most people never looked at until the structure failed. Now, this is what I call the temporal trap. The harm of a wholesale identity breach does not materialize immediately. It materializes over years in fraud cases, in targeted scams using your actual biographical details, in state-level identity manipulation, in systems you don't even know are cross-referencing your data for purposes you've never consented to. By the time the harm is visible, the story's cold. The people who are responsible have moved on. There have been 800 more news cycles, and the accountability window, which is always narrow, has closed. The temporal trap is compounded by what I call the complexity barrier. This story requires you to understand what numident is. It requires you to know what the Hatch Act says and why it matters. It requires you to track a timeline across multiple agencies, multiple court cases, multiple whistleblower complaints, and multiple news cycles. I had never heard of the numident database before this story. The media system, not through conspiracy, just through optimization, knows that complexity kills engagement. Simple is shareable. Complex gets compressed into a forward chyron and then dropped when something simpler comes along. The story cannot be told in 90 seconds, so the story doesn't get told. And then there's the tribalism trap, which I have already mentioned, but I want to go deeper on it here because it's the most effective suppression mechanism in the current media environment. The moment this story gets tagged as an anti-DOGE story, the moment it's associated with the political frame that opposes the current administration, a significant portion of the country decides it's propaganda. Not because they have evaluated the evidence, but because the tag triggers a pre-existing response. The tag does the work so the evidence doesn't have to be engaged with. And the official response to this story has been expertly designed to apply that tag as quickly as possible. Fake news, desperate for clicks, scaring seniors. Every one of those phrases is a tribal signal. Every one of them is designed to tell a specific audience, this is a story from the other team and you don't have to take it seriously. All three traps, temporal delay, complexity barrier, tribal override, are operating simultaneously on this story. And the cumulative effect is that one of the most significant documented breaches of American identity infrastructure is being covered like a mid-sized political scandal that will be forgotten by next week.
If you know something, if you see something, you have a duty to your fellow Americans to step up and find a way to get the truth out there.
There's something I want to say directly here, and I want to be clear that I'm saying it about the system rather than about any individual journalist or outlet. You are not the customer of the media machine, the news system. You are the product. Your attention is the commodity being sold. Engagement is the metric being optimized for. And it turns out that your attention is worth more to the platforms, to the algorithms, to the advertisers, when it's directed at something that produces a fast, strong feeling than when it's directed at something that requires sustained, slow thinking. Outrage is more engaging than analysis. Tribal confirmation is more engaging than structural examination. A story with a clear villain and a clear team is more engaging than a story about systemic architecture and institutional failure. Trapthink exists in the gap between what engages and what matters, and the gap on this story is one of the widest I've ever seen. Okay, so we both need a moment here, because when you're in the middle of laying out a story like this, when you're tracking a 14-month timeline of federal data access, whistleblower complaints, court filings, denial strategies, and the slow-motion dismantling of identity infrastructure overnight, there comes a point when you just have to stop, look directly at the raw, uncut, magnificent absurdity of what you're describing. Because if you don't do that, the episode becomes a long stress response, and that doesn't help anybody. So let's take stock. A software engineer, a young man with a computer science background who, at some point, was given access to the most sensitive government database in the United States, allegedly walked out of the Social Security Administration carrying a thumb drive. On that thumb drive, the documented identity of every living American and the records of more than 160 million Americans who have died. He then went to his new job at a private company. Then he told his coworkers about it. Not one coworker, multiple coworkers. And in describing his former position at his current situation, he apparently used the phrase God-level access. God-level access. Not admin privileges, not elevated clearance, not broad system access with limited oversight. The man looked at his coworkers in the eye at his civilian job at the government contracting firm he had just joined and described his access to the identity records of 330 million Americans as God-level. And then, when one of those coworkers, apparently a reasonable person with a reasonable amount of concern about federal data protection laws, raised the possibility that this might not be entirely legal, the response was, "Don't worry, I'll get a pardon." A pardon! Preloaded, already expected, already accounted for in the man's risk calculation. I want to appreciate the confidence that requires, the sheer architectural audacity of it. Most people, when they're confronted with the suggestion that they may have committed what a sitting United States senator has called one of the largest data breaches in American history, would at a minimum lower their profile, quietly return the thumb drive, perhaps not walk into their new corporate job and describe the situation to multiple colleagues while requesting their assistance in data sanitization. This man's strategy was apparently be completely open about it, ask for help, and trust that the presidential pardon pipeline is already in place. And then the Social Security Administration's official response to all of this, the formal, on-the-record statement from a federal agency, was that the newspaper that reported it was desperate for clicks and trying to scare old people. And then the Inspector General opened an investigation anyway. I just want to make sure that we are all seeing this clearly. Because sometimes the most important thing is to describe reality accurately and let reality do the work. There is a reason that I do this section like this on most of my episodes. It's not because the subject matter isn't serious. It is because the human brain can only sustain heavy analytical weight for so long before it needs a release valve. And honestly, because sometimes the absurdity is part of the truth. The distance between how these things are presented and how they actually are is itself information. It tells you something important about the confidence of the people involved. When someone tells their coworkers about their stolen thumb drive with federal identity data on it, and then invokes the presidential pardon preemptively, they are not acting like someone who thinks they might get caught. They are acting like someone who is operating under a set of rules that are different from the ones the rest of us are subject to. That should concern you, regardless of your politics. That should concern you. All right, I needed that. Now let's bring this thing home. So what do you do with this? Trapthink has never been a show about generating outrage. Outrage is cheap. It's available everywhere, requires no analysis, and produces nothing. Trapthink is about awareness that leads to understanding that leads to action. And today, the action section looks different from some of the previous episodes because this is not a story with a simple prescription. It is a story about systemic architecture, and systemic architecture requires a different kind of response. So let me give you 3 exits from this trap, 3 ways of engaging with this story that actually do something. Exit 1, sustained attention. The most important thing you can do right now is refuse to let this story get buried. Not by staying outraged, outrage burns out, but by staying informed and staying present with the story as it develops. The Inspector General is investigating. The GAO is auditing. Congressional committees have launched probes. Those processes are slow, they're procedural, and they operate almost entirely in the dark unless there is sustained pressure from the public that demands transparency. When a story drops out of sight from the public conversation, the pressure drops with it. When the pressure drops, investigation timelines quietly extend. When the timelines extend, the people with institutional power to manage the outcome do manage it. The investigation narrows. The findings get classified. The report comes out 18 months later and says less than the original allegations, and by then, nobody gives a rat's ass. Your consistent attention is not nothing. It's a material force in how these processes unfold. Share this episode. Send the reporting to people who haven't seen it. Ask your representatives by name in writing what oversight they are exercising on the SSA IG investigation. You are a citizen. This is your data. This is not a metaphor. Exit 2. Structural skepticism applied without partisanship. I'm not asking you to believe the worst about any individual or institution. I am asking you to apply consistent structural logic. Who has access to what, under what oversight, and with what accountability? And does that match the stated mission? Those questions do not require a villain. They don't require you to hate DOGE or support DOGE. They don't require any political position whatsoever. They only require that you treat government power, any administration's government power, the way the founders designed the republic to treat it, with skepticism, with oversight requirements, and with an insistence on answers. Any administration that grants unfettered access to the master identity database of the entire country without clear statutory authority, without transparency to career staff, and without an operational justification tied to the stated mission deserves hard questions. That's not partisan. That's constitutional. It applies to the next administration too, and the one after that. Exit 3. Connect the pattern. What happened at the SSA is not an isolated incident. It is one data point in a pattern of DOGE accessing sensitive federal data across multiple agencies. The Treasury Department, the IRS, the Department of Health and Human Services, and others. Each story gets covered as its own discrete event. Each one gets a day or two of attention, and then the next one comes out and the previous one is already background. But they are not discrete events. They are a pattern, and patterns reveal intent in ways that individual incidents cannot. The next time a story breaks about DOGE accessing sensitive federal data somewhere, and there will be a next time, read it alongside this one. Hold them together. Ask what the aggregate picture looks like, because the individual stories are being managed separately for a reason. The aggregate picture is the story the individual headlines are designed to prevent you from assembling. This episode gave you a piece of the aggregate picture. Use it. There is an ancient story from the Greeks about a woman named Pandora. She is given a jar. She is told explicitly, do not open it. She opens it anyway. Everything inside escapes into the world. Pain, disease, sorrow. Things that have never before existed in the world now do, irreversibly because the container was opened. Most people know this story as a cautionary tale about curiosity, but I want to offer you a different reading. This story is about irreversibility. It is about the gap between the moment of action and the full weight of its consequences. Pandora opens the jar in a moment. The things that escape from it will inhabit the world for the rest of recorded history. That decision takes a second. The result is permanent. And one more thing from the original myth. The one detail that almost always gets left out when the story is told casually. At the bottom of the jar, after everything else has escaped, there was one thing remaining. Hope. Still inside, sealed. I've been thinking about that detail for a week. Charles Borges understood irreversibility. He spent his professional life protecting a container, the largest identity container in the United States government. And when he saw it being opened without proper authority, without proper safeguards, without the oversight that would at least let someone know what was escaping and where it was going, he did the thing that the system makes costly. He told the truth. He filed the disclosure. He went on the record. He accepted the professional risk because he understood what was at stake. He was told he was wrong, but he was not wrong. Behind every record in those databases is a person, a real one, someone who applied for a Social Security card at some point, probably didn't think twice about it, because you don't think twice about it. Someone who filed taxes, opened a bank account, got a job, signed a lease, had a child, lived their life in the ordinary, unremarkable way that ordinary, unremarkable people live. Someone who trusted, as we all trust, without even articulating the trust, that the infrastructure of identity in this country was being held carefully, that there were people whose job it was to protect it, that the rules existed for a reason, and that people with access to the most sensitive possible information were operating under those rules. That trust, ordinary, unremarkable, never articulated because it never had to be, is what is at stake in this story. Not the politics, not the party affiliation of anyone involved, the trust. Proverbs 4:7 says, "Wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom, and in all you're getting, get understanding." We started there and I want to come back to it at the close, because the information about this story has been available since August of last year. Borges filed his complaint. It was public. The court filings in January, public. The thumb drive story this week is also public. The information was there. What wasn't there was understanding of what these databases actually contain and why they cannot be replaced. Understanding of what the timeline means when you read it all together rather than each piece separately. Understanding why the deflection strategy is itself evidence. Understanding of the irreversibility, the Pandora problem at the center of it all. Understanding is harder than information. It requires time. It requires sitting with a thing long enough to see the shape of it. It requires being willing to hold complexity without resolving it into the nearest available team. That's what this was for. Not to make you angry, though if you are a little angry, that's an appropriate response to the facts. Not to make you trust any particular institution or distrust any particular person. But to give you enough understanding to refuse to let this story disappear into the algorithm the way the stories before it did. The jar has been opened. We do not yet know how much has escaped, or where it has gone, or what it will become out there in the world. That is the honest statement of where we are. But hope is still in the jar. It is still there as long as someone is watching, as long as someone is asking the question that the institutions involved don't want asked. As long as there are people who understand the difference between information and wisdom, and who refuse to mistake the noise for the signal. Someone needs to be watching. If this episode gave you something, then share it, because the person you share it with probably has a social security number too, and they deserve to understand what's happening to it. I'm Darren. Stay curious, stay honest, stay human, and I'll talk to you later in the week for Trap Check.